So, you want to buy a sports team. Not a small one, a real one. A franchise in a major league. The kind that shows up on television every week. You picture the fun part immediately, the private box, the handshake at midfield, the jersey with your name stitched into the lining somewhere nobody will ever see it but you. Here's the strange part. Almost none of these teams make real money from playing the sport. Some lose money every single year on paper. And yet the people who own them keep getting richer year after year by staggering amounts. That's not a contradiction. That's the whole business model, and once you understand why, you'll never watch a game the same way again. Let's start with what you think you're buying. You assume the price tag is the hard part. It isn't even the interesting part. In American football in 1989, an oil executive named Jerry Jones bought a struggling franchise for around $140 million. At the time, that team was losing roughly $1 million a month. People around the sport thought he had lost his mind. Today, that same franchise is valued at around $13 billion. Not because it wins constantly. It hasn't reached a championship game in 3 decades, but because of everything we're about to walk through. That's the entry price for a legacy team, one that's already established. But here's the thing, nobody explains to you at the start. You can almost never just buy your way into a league from scratch. You can't build a new stadium, hire some players, and declare yourself a member of a top-tier league the way you could open a restaurant on any street corner in your city. The league has to let you in. And the leagues that matter only let new members in when they decide to expand. And they make you pay for the privilege of diluting everyone else's slice of the pie. Right now, a new team joining a major basketball league in an expansion city is expected to pay somewhere between $7 billion and $10 billion just for the right to exist. That money doesn't build a single seat in a stadium. It gets split among the owners who are already there as compensation for the extra mouth at the table. Think about that for a second. You could pay $10 billion and still not own a single player, a single building, or a single ticket. You just own a license to play. This is the first thing you need to understand about this business, and it explains everything that follows. There is no such thing as free competition here. Anyone with enough capital can open a second coffee shop across the street from the first one. Nobody can open a second version of a major league team in the same market without the league's permission, and the league almost never gives it. Economists have a boring word for this. It's called scarcity. But scarcity that's created on purpose and protected by rule behaves less like a market and more like a private club with a members-only waiting list that never actually gets shorter. Compare it to diamonds. A diamond isn't rare because there are only a few of them buried in the earth. It's valuable because the supply reaching the market is deliberately controlled. Sports franchises work on the same logic, except the supply is a fixed number of seats at a table. 30 teams in one league, 32 in another, and that number almost never grows. So the first reason these things are worth so much is simple. There will never be more of them, but that alone doesn't explain why the value keeps climbing decade after decade. For that, we have to talk about where the actual money comes from, and it's not the thing you're picturing. Ask a fan how a team makes money and they'll say tickets, jerseys, hot dogs, parking. All reasonable guesses, all mostly wrong. Those things are real revenue, but they're small and they're capped. A stadium only holds so many seats. A season only has so many home games. You cannot sell more hot dogs than there are people in the building. And there are only so many buildings you can fill in a year. Meanwhile, the 2 biggest expenses in this business, player salaries and stadium debt, climb every single year whether the team wins or loses. So the gap between what game day brings in and what the operation costs can be razor thin. Sometimes it's negative. One elite European football club posted a pre-tax loss of over £260 million in a single recent season. Its parent company posted an even larger loss, north of £700 million once you counted the enormous cost of assembling a roster of players. This is one of the most famous, most watched clubs on the planet, playing to sold-out crowds, and on paper in that year it lost money on a scale that would bankrupt most companies outright. Its valuation kept climbing anyway, past $4 billion. That's the pattern. A basketball franchise in New York posted an $80 million operating loss one year and a $34 million loss the next, while simultaneously setting attendance records. Then a small ownership slice sold for a price that valued the whole team at nearly $6 billion. So here's the question that actually matters. If the operation itself is sometimes bleeding money, where is $6 billion of value coming from? To answer that, we need to talk about the thing that quietly took over this entire industry, television. Well, television and everything that came after it. Before broadcasting, a team's fortunes were tied entirely how many people physically walked through the gate. That's it. If your city was small, your ceiling was small. Then television arrived and the entire industry flipped upside down. A live game turned out to be one of the last things people reliably watch as it happens, rather than skipping ahead or catching later. Nearly everything else, shows, movies, even news gets consumed on the viewer's own schedule now. Live sport doesn't work that way. You watch it live or the moment is gone. Advertisers will pay an enormous premium for that kind of guaranteed real time because it's become rare. That premium shows up in staggering broadcast contracts. American football's national television deals, running from 2023 through 2033, are worth roughly $110 billion combined, split across traditional networks, cable sports channels, and streaming platforms. Basketball's national media package, covering the following 11 seasons, is worth somewhere around $76 billion, shared among a similar mix of broadcasters and streaming companies. Here is the part that should stop you for a second. That national money gets divided roughly evenly among every team in the league, largely regardless of how the team actually performs on the field. A team that finishes at the bottom of the standings still collects close to the same national broadcast check as the team that wins the championship. Your on-field performance barely moves this number. Your presence in the league is what moves it. Layer on top of that the local broadcast deals, where an individual team sells the rights to show its own games in its own region, and you start to see the real shape of the business. The game itself, the 3 hours on the field, is really just the content that justifies the contract. The contract is the business, but contracts alone don't explain why a losing team can still be financially stable. For that, we need to look at something most fans have never heard of. You'd think the richest teams in the richest cities would simply crush everyone else financially, buy every good player, and turn the league into a permanent parade of the same 3 winners. That would be logical. It's also exactly what the leagues have spent decades preventing, because a predictable league is a boring league, and a boring league loses viewers, so the leagues force teams to share. American football pools all national broadcast money and splits it equally. And on top of that, a little over a third of every team's ticket revenue gets thrown into a shared pool and divided evenly across all 32 teams. When you add it all up, roughly 2/3 of the league's football-related income gets shared equally. Whether you're in the biggest city in the country or one of the smallest, baseball takes a different approach. Every team contributes just under half of its local revenue, the money it makes locally from broadcasting, tickets, concessions, parking, into a central pool, which then gets divided evenly. That single mechanism moves more than $200 million a year from large market teams to small market ones. Basketball pools half of what's called basketball-related income and redistributes it to help balance the weaker markets. Though it does require those smaller teams to hit a minimum revenue threshold first, so owners can't simply collect a check without trying. None of this is charity, it's insurance. If the small market teams go broke or become permanently hopeless, the whole league gets less interesting. Ratings fall everywhere, and the big teams lose value too. So the rich teams subsidize the poor ones not out of kindness, but because a healthy league is worth more everyone than a lopsided one. That covers revenue. Now we need to talk about the other half of the equation, cost, because the leagues control that just as tightly plutocratic salaries are the single biggest expense in this business. And if left uncontrolled, the richest owners would simply buy every star player in existence. So most major leagues impose a hard limit on how much a team can spend on its roster in a given year. American football's version of this limit is strict. Heading into the 2026 season, the league-wide cap sits at just over $300 per team, up more than $20 million from the year before, and roughly $100 million higher than it was just 4 years earlier. That's how fast this number moves. Teams also have to spend a minimum amount. They can't just hoard cash and field a cheap roster either. Basketball runs what's called a soft cap, meaning teams can go over the line under certain conditions, but the league punishes heavy spenders with an escalating luxury tax and a set of restrictions nicknamed aprons that limit what an overspending team is even allowed to do in trades and free agency. Cross a certain spending threshold, and you start losing access to tools other teams still have. Cross a second, higher threshold, and future draft picks can even get frozen. Why does any of this matter to you, the prospective owner? Because it means your biggest expense is not actually unlimited, and neither is your competitors. The cap exists to keep outcomes uncertain because, and this is the part that's easy to forget, fans do not pay to watch a guaranteed outcome. Nobody tunes in every week to watch the same team win by the same margin. Uncertainty is the product. The salary cap is what manufactures it. Between revenue sharing and salary caps, the leagues have built something unusual. It behaves less like a jungle where the strongest simply eat the weakest, and more like a cartel where every member has agreed to protect the value of the whole club. That protection is a huge part of why franchise values almost never collapse, even when individual teams lose on the field for years at a time. Now let's talk about the most controversial line item in the entire business: the building itself. A modern stadium can cost well over $1 billion to build. Here's the uncomfortable fact. Much of that money often doesn't come from the team owner. It comes from the public. One recent NFL stadium project came in around $2.1 billion, with roughly $1.26 billion, about 60% of the total, funded by taxpayers. Another came in at $1.4 billion, with about $850 million in public money behind it. A third came in at $2 billion, with about $750 million in public funding. How does a private business get a city to hand over hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars? Leverage. Because there are only so many teams in existence, and every city without one desperately wants one, an owner can credibly threaten to move the team somewhere else unless the city builds them a new home. Cities, afraid of losing the jobs, the pride, and the television exposure that come with hosting a major franchise, frequently give in. The economists who actually study this, independently of the leagues, have said for years that these public subsidies rarely deliver the broad economic boost that gets promised. Money spent on a ticket or a beer at the stadium is usually money that would have been spent somewhere else nearby anyway. A local restaurant, a movie theater, a bowling alley. It doesn't multiply, it just moves. But for the owner, the stadium isn't really about civic benefit. It's a private cash machine built substantially with someone else's money. Luxury suites, corporate naming rights, concerts, and conventions during the off-season. These revenue streams often belong entirely to the owner, outside the revenue-sharing formulas we just discussed. In some cases, the real estate around the stadium eventually becomes worth more than the team that plays inside it. Which brings us to the part of this business that almost no fan ever thinks about at all. A game lasts about 3 hours. A season might give you 8 to 10 home games. That leaves the rest of the calendar year completely open, and the smartest owners in this business have figured out how to fill every single day of it. Around one stadium in the American South, an ownership group built a 77-acre neighborhood from scratch. Hotels, apartments, offices, restaurants, a concert venue anchored by the ballpark but not dependent on it. The land underneath that development was worth around $5 million a decade ago. By 2022, it was worth roughly $736 million in a single recent year. The district pulled in over 10 million visitors, and the majority of them, more than 7 million, showed up on days when there wasn't even a game happening. They came for the restaurant, the concert, the office job, the hotel room. A basketball team in the American Midwest did something similar downtown, building out a 30-acre neighborhood around its arena, collecting rent from the shops and offices instead of just ticket revenue from the games. This is the real shape of a modern franchise. It's not a sports team with a side business. It's a real estate and media company that happened to field a team, because the team is what draws the crowd that makes the real estate valuable in the first place. Meet Robert Kraft. Before he owned a football team, he was a paper and packaging businessman from Massachusetts who grew up going to games as a kid and decades later bought season tickets in the worst seat in the stadium just to be close to the team he loved. In 1994, he paid a then record price of around $172 million for the franchise. And when you add in the surrounding land and the stadium lease, the full transaction came to around $227 million. People close to the deal thought he had wildly overpaid. Today, that same franchise is valued at roughly $9 billion. And a small minority stake alone recently sold to an outside investment firm at a price that confirmed the number. So, how does a fan with no experience running a professional sports organization end up building one of the most valuable franchises on the planet? The honest answer has almost nothing to do with him personally being a genius at football. It has everything to do with timing. He bought in right as national broadcast contracts were about to explode in value, right before the salary cap era began stabilizing costs across the league, and right as the surrounding real estate near his stadium started to become one of the most valuable pieces of commercial land in the region. He didn't out-negotiate the market. He was standing in the right spot when the tide came in, and the tide has kept rising for over 30 years since. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it cuts against the story people like to tell about these owners. It's rarely a single brilliant decision that makes a franchise worth billions. It's the structure underneath the entire industry. The scarcity, the shared media money, the protected real estate, doing the heavy lifting decade after decade, almost regardless of who's sitting in the owner's box. Now let's talk about what happens when that structure breaks, even briefly, because it has, and the numbers involved are enormous. In 1994, Major League Baseball's players went on strike over a dispute about salary structure, and the season simply stopped in the middle of August. The World Series, which had been played every year since 1904, was canceled outright for the first time in 90 years. No games, no tickets, no local broadcast revenue, no concessions. For months, every single revenue stream tied to game day went to zero, while the fixed costs of running a franchise, stadium debt, staff salaries, long-term contracts, kept accruing regardless. The financial damage ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars across the league, and it took years for attendance to fully recover afterward because a meaningful share of fans simply stopped trusting the sport and didn't come back right away. Here's the structural lesson underneath that story, and it applies to every league, not just that one. A franchise's most expensive costs are locked in years in advance. Stadium debt doesn't pause because of a labor dispute. Long-term player contracts don't pause either. But revenue can stop instantly the moment the league and the players' union fail to agree on how to split the money. When you own a team, you're never just betting on your own business decisions. You are betting on the ability of billionaires and players to keep agreeing with each other year after year on how to divide an enormous and growing pie. When that agreement breaks down, even for a single season, the bill lands on the owner regardless of how well the team was run. Keep that in mind before you assume the money only flows one direction. Let's walk through what a single year might actually look like for an established, mid-size franchise using the kind of round figures that show up across the industry. Start with revenue. A typical team in a major league might collect somewhere around $200 million from its share of the national broadcast deal alone, largely guaranteed regardless of performance. Add local broadcast rights, ticket sales, concessions, parking, and sponsorships, and total revenue for a mid-market team might land somewhere between $350 and $450 million in a given year. Now subtract the costs. Player payroll bumping up against a salary cap that recently crossed $300 million in one league is easily the largest single expense. Add coaching staff, front office salaries, travel, insurance, marketing, and the debt service on a stadium that may have cost over $1 billion to build. Put all of that together, and operating costs for a single season can also land in the range of $300 to $400 million. That leaves a genuinely thin operating margin in a normal year. Sometimes tens of millions of dollars in profit, sometimes close to break even, sometimes a loss, depend on how the roster and the injuries in the market shook out that particular season. Now, compare that number to what happens to the value of the franchise itself in that same year.